Okay, this is third section of Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology, Masks of God series. We are in the prologue titled Toward a Natural History of the Gods and Heroes. And I'm going to pick up at section 3, the dialogue of scholarship and romance. The quest for a scientific approach to mythology was hampered until the end of the last century by the magnitude of the field and scattered character of the evidence. The conflict of authorities, theories, and opinions that raged in the course particularly of the 19th century, when the ranges of knowledge were expanding in every field of research, classical and oriental scholarship, comparative philology, folklore, Egyptology, Bible criticism, anthropology, etc., resembled the mad tumult of the old Buddhist parable of the blind men and the elephant. The blind men, feeling the animal's head, declared, "An elephant is like a water pot." But those at his ears, "He is like a winnowing basket." Those at his tusks, "No, indeed, he is like a plowshare." And those at his trunk, "He is like a plow pole." There were a number feeling his belly. "Why," they cried, "he is like a storage bin." Those feeling his legs argued that he was like pillars. Those at his rectum, that he was like a mortar. Those at his member, that he was like a pestle. While the remainder at his tail were shouting, "An elephant is like a fan." And they fought furiously among themselves with their fists, shouting and crying, "This is what an elephant is like. This is not what an elephant is like. This is not what an elephant is like. This is what an elephant is like." And precisely so then runs the moral of the Buddha. The company of heretics, monks, Brahmins, and wandering ascetics, patient of heresy, delighting in heresy, relying upon the reliance of heretical views, are blind, without eyes, knowing not good, knowing not evil, knowing not right, knowing not wrong. They quarrel and brawl and wrangle and strike one another with the daggers of their tongues, saying, "This is right, that is not right. This is not right, that is right." The two learned disciplines from which the lineaments of a sound comparative science might first have emerged were those of the classics and the Bible. However, a fundamental tenet of the Christian tradition made it appear to be an act of blasphemy to compare the two on the same plane of thought. For while the myths of the Greeks were recognized to be of the natural order, those of the Bible were supposed to be supernatural. Hence, while the prodigies of the classical heroes, Heracles, Theseus, Perseus, etc., were studied as literature, those of the Hebrews, Noah, Moses, Joshua, Jesus, Peter, etc., had to be argued as objective history. Whereas actually the fabulous elements common to the two precisely contemporary Eastern Mediterranean traditions were derived equally from the preceding Bronze Age civilization of Mesopotamia, and no one before the development of the modern science of archaeology could have guessed. A third and ultimately the most disturbing discipline contributing to the tumult of the scene was the rapidly developing science of Aryan Indo-Germanic or Indo-European philology. As early as 1767, a French Jesuit in India, Father Cordeau, had observed that Sanskrit and Latin were remarkably alike. Sir William Jones, 1746 to 1794, the West's first considerable Sanskritist, judge of the Supreme Court of Judicature at Calcutta, and founder of the Bengal Asiatic Society, was the next to observe the relationship, and from a comparative study of the grammatical structures of Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, concluded that all three had sprung, as he phrased it, from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. Franz Bopp, 1791 to 1867, published in 1816 a comparative study of the Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Persian, and Germanic systems of conjugation. And finally, by the middle of the century, it was perfectly clear that a prodigious distribution of closely related tongues could be identified over the greater part of the civilized world. A single, broadly scattered family of languages that must have sprung from a single source, and which includes, besides Sanskrit and Pali, the language of the Buddhist scriptures, most of the tongues of northern India, as well as Sinhalese, the language of Ceylon, Persian, Armenian, Albanian, and Bulgarian, Polish, Russian, and the other Slavic tongues, Greek, Latin, and all the languages of Europe except Estonian, Finnish, Lap, Magyar, and Basque. Thus, a continuum from Ireland to India had been revealed. And not only the languages, but also the civilizations and religions, mythologies, literary forms, and modes of thought of the peoples involved could be readily compared. For example, the Vedic pantheon of ancient India, the Eddic of medieval Iceland, and the Olympian of the Greeks. No wonder the leading scholars and philosophers of the century were impressed. The discovery appeared to indicate that the most productive as well as philosophically mature constellation of peoples in the history of civilization had been associated with this prodigious ethnic diffusion. For it seemed that even in the Orient, the homeland of many darker races, it had been the lighter-skinned Indo-Aryans who had given the chief impulse to the paramount cultural trend, namely, that represented in its earliest recorded phase by the Sanskrit Vedas and the Vedic pantheon, so close in form and spirit to the Homeric hymns and Olympian pantheon of the Greeks, that the Alexandrians had had no difficulty in recognizing analogies. And in its later, more highly developed phase, by the gospel of Gautama Buddha, whose princely mind, inspired by what many scholars throughout Europe took to be a characteristically Aryan type of spirituality, had touched with magic the whole of the Orient, lifting temples and pagodas not to any god, but to Buddhahood, that is to say, the purified, perfected, fully flowered, and fully illuminated consciousness of man himself. It was a fateful, potentially very dangerous discovery, for even though announced in the terminology of a tranquil scholarship, it coincided with a certain emotional tendency of the time. In the light of the numerous discoveries then being made in every quarter of the broadly opening fields of the physical, biological, and geographical sciences, the mythological creation story in the Old Testament could no longer be accepted as literally true. Already, in the early 17th century, the heliocentric universe had been condemned as contrary to Holy Scripture, both by Luther and by the Roman Catholic Inquisition. In the 19th century, the tendency of the learned world was rather to reject Holy Scripture as contrary to fact. And with the Hebrew Scripture went the Hebrew God, and the Christian claim to divine authority as well. The Renaissance had opposed to the Judeo-Christian ideal of obedience to a supposed revelation of God's law, the humanism of the Greeks. And with the discovery now of this impressive ethnic continuity, uniting that humanism on the one hand with the profound non-theological religiosity of the Indian Upanishads and Buddhist sutras, and on the other hand, with the primitive vitality of the pagan Germans, who had shattered Christianized Rome only to be subdued and Christianized themselves in turn, the cause of the pagan against the Judeo-Christian portion of the European cultural inheritance seemed to be greatly enhanced. Moreover, the evidence appeared to point to Europe itself as the homeland from which this profoundly inspired and vigorously creative spiritual tradition sprang, and specifically the area of the Germanies. A shock of romantic European elation quivered through the scientific world. The Grimm brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm, 1785 to 1863 and 1786 to 1859, gathered the fairy tales of their collection with the belief that there might be discovered in them the broken remains of a nuclear Indo-European mythology. Schopenhauer greeted the Sanskrit Upanishads as the most rewarding and elevating reading possible in the world. And Wagner found in the old Germanic mythologies of Wotan, Loki, Siegfried, and the Rhine maidens the proper vehicle of his German genius. Thus it was that when a couple of dilettantes with creative imagination brought this sensational product of philological research out of the studies of the scholars, where thought leads to further thought, into the field of political life, where thought leads to action, and one thought is enough, a potentially very dangerous situation was created. The first step in this direction was taken in 1839 when a French aristocrat, Quartet de L'Aile, proposed a theory of politics on the basis of what he conceived to be the new science in a work entitled, I don't know much French, so I will try, La science politique fondée sur la science de l'homme aux études des races humaines. Sorry, French speakers can help me out. Paris, 1839. The tendency was developed in Count Arthur de Gobineau's 4-volume Essai sur les inégalités des races humaines, 1853 to 1855, and Count Vacher de la Poge's L'Ariane et son rôle social, 1899, and required finally only the celebrated work of Wagner's English son-in-law, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, The Foundations of the 19th Century, 1890 to 1891, to supply the background for Alfred Rosenberg's Der Mythos des 20 Jahrhunderts, 1930, and break the planet into flames. Clearly, mythology is no toy for children, nor is it a matter of archaic, merely scholarly concern, of no moment to modern men, of action. For its symbols, whether in the tangible form of images or in the abstract form of ideas, touch and release the deepest centers of motivation, moving literate and illiterate alike, moving mobs, moving civilizations. There is a real danger, therefore, in the incongruity of focus that has brought the latest findings of technological research into the foreground of modern life, joining the world in a single community while leaving the anthropological and psychological discoveries from which a commensurable moral system might have been developed in the learned publications where they first appeared. For surely it is folly to preach to children who will be riding rockets to the moon a morality and cosmology based on concepts of the good society and of man's place in nature that were coined before the harnessing of the horse. And the world is now far too small, and men's stake in sanity too great for any more of those old games of chosen folk, whether of Jehovah, Allah, Wotan, Manu, or the devil, by which tribesmen were sustained against their enemies in the days when the serpent could still talk. The ghostly, anachronistic sounds of Aryan battle cries faded rapidly from the 19th century theaters of learning as a broader realization of the community of man developed, due primarily to a mass of completely unforeseen information from the pioneers of archaeology and anthropology. For example, it soon appeared not only that the earliest Indo-European tribes must already have been mixed of a number of races, but also that the greater part of what had been taken to be of their invention actually had been derived from the earlier, very much more highly developed cultures of ancient Egypt, Crete, and Mesopotamia. Moreover, the worldwide diffusion of the major themes of classical as well as biblical mythology and religious lore, far beyond any possible influence either of Aryan or of Semite, so greatly magnified the frame of the prehistory of civilization that the old problems, prides, and prejudices were rendered out of date. And with that, we'll close this section. Next time we'll pick up on the second portion of part 3, which will go through a chronology of discoveries. We'll start with this chronology of discoveries and then complete the prologue. Thank you for joining me. Enjoy your day.